At this time, it's my pleasure to welcome back an old colleague and friend, Ann Collins-Goodyear, who will be our last presenter today, and then we'll have an afternoon panel discussion when she's finished. Ann Collins-Goodyear, PhD, is co-director of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. Goodyear serves as president of the College Art Association and is a founding member of the Smithsonian's Time-Based and Digital Art Working Group. She co-edited with Margaret Weitkamp Artifacts, Studies in the History of Science and Technology, Volume 9, Analyzing Art and Aesthetics, and is co-editing with James W. McManus, aka Marcel Duchamp, Meditations on the Identities of an Artist. She and McManus are also co-editors of Inventing Marcel Duchamp, The Dynamics of Portraiture. Her work has been recognized with the Smithsonian Secretary's Research Award and citations from the Association of Art Museum Curators and the American Association of Museums. Her recent research has been supported by the Luce Foundation, the Florence Gould Foundation, the Smithsonian Scholarly Studies Fund, and the Smithsonian Grand Challenges Consortia. Ann?
Before starting my formal remarks, I want to offer a very warm thank you to my colleagues here at the Smithsonian, and in particular, Chris, Tierna, Ali Jessing, for making this invitation possible. I'm delighted to be here, and I also want to extend my congratulations to John Hanhart, Michael Mansfield, and all of their colleagues at the Smithsonian American Art Museum for really an extraordinary exhibition and creating a platform for what I have found to be an extremely engaging conversation. And indeed, as I look at my written remarks, I'm finding that it's turning into a bit of a palimpsest because there are so many ideas that I found stimulating today that I, on a few occasions, will try to respond to. So as I have already indicated, it's a special pleasure to be here today and to have this opportunity to speak broadly about the question of initiatives in the preservation of time-based media art. From my perspective as a curator and now a director of a small college museum, this area represents one of the most exciting and challenging areas for museums today. As John Hanhart has noted, quote, "The history of 20th century art will be rewritten through the moving image," close quotes. This impulse will no doubt be abetted by our own growing reliance on a diverse range of new visual technologies and our collective desire to better understand the origins of these new modes of seeing and experiencing the world. Growing recognition of the importance of this new area of cultural heritage preservation was evident from a recent prominently placed article in the New York Times addressing the fascinating challenges implicit in the preservation of Douglas Davis's world's first collaborative sentence. The web-based work, which invited participation from its audience, appropriately for the present gathering, was created as an homage to Paik. Today, familiar with the rapid pace of technological change, we are finally catching up with Paik, who observed in 1969, quote, "The real issue implied in art and technology is not to make another scientific toy, but how to humanize the technology and the electronic medium, which is progressing rapidly, too rapidly. Progress has already outstripped its ability to program," close quotes. As this symposium has clearly demonstrated, the backdrop of an exhibition of the work of Namjoon Paik provides a particularly apt occasion to address the urgent necessity of flexible models for the collecting, care, and preservation of time-based and digital art. A pioneer of video art, Paik implicitly understood the capacity of electronic media to connect diverse audiences around the world. His 1984 interactive work, Good Morning, Mr. Orwell, interlaced audiences and performers in Paris and New York, and despite technical glitches, demonstrated the arrival of our contemporary global village. And of course, it was Paik who famously coined the term electronic superhighway in a 1974 application to the Rockefeller Foundation. The interactive promise of this conduit is reflected in his artwork of this title, part of the Smithsonian American Art Museum's collection. The inclusion of a small monitor in the upper right, let's see, on the East Coast, representing Washington, D.C., which captures audiences in the gallery viewing the work, is truly delightful, transforming the piece from a mere passive artifact to something which invites and benefits from the ongoing engagement of viewers who implicitly allow it to act on them and in turn transform it continually. Such an approach to art making is a far cry from the romantic stereotype of a garroted artist working independently, creating self-sufficient masterworks awaiting recognition. The implicit assumption that such apparently self-contained artworks, paintings, sculptures, and so forth, could survive stoically without intervention is, of course, easily susceptible to challenge, but worth invoking in this context because of the care paradigm such a model of art making invites. In particular, the implicit expectation that works of art can thrive from benign neglect, existing independently of a changing world, just as their makers themselves, mythically at least, distance themselves from everyday concerns to create their masterworks. Today, the production, acquisition, and care and display of time-based and digital media art might best be considered in terms of a larger ecosystem, a complex interactive matrix benefiting from and requiring input from a wide range of specialists, just as Paik surmised the special promise of such works. Is their ability to promote the interaction of a diverse community of viewers. What intrigues me most of all is the active role demanded for management of these activities, and it is to this question that I would like to turn my attention as we consider a larger history of initiatives in the preservation of time-based media art. Since the fall of 2009, I have had the pleasure of being part of the Smithsonian's Time-Based and Digital Media Working Group, a group of colleagues based at the Smithsonian addressing the question of how to protect new media art, and I do want to acknowledge them all for their extraordinary work in this area. This group grew out of a broad spread recognition that our commitment as museum professionals to care for new media artworks entrusted to us implied the need for new practices that would span a host of professional categories. In my own case, as the National Portrait Gallery contemplated the acquisition of its first time-based work in 2008, I became acutely aware that in order to bring this groundbreaking acquisition into the collection, it was necessary to have some sort of care plan. The Late Night Triad, a born digital artwork by Jason Salavon, combined 64 continual nights of opening monologues by each of the then leading three late-night TV hosts, here from left to right, Jay Leno, Conan O'Brien, and David Letterman. The work, created in 2003, used a computer to combine video images recorded from conventional TV with a 4:3 aspect ratio. In homage to the traditional TV, as well as with a nod to the I Ching, we discern the lingering influence of Paik. And although Salavon's work relies on projection rather than the artifact of the TV set itself, the very look of the piece provides an important reminder of the fleeting nature of technological media many of us came to take for granted. By the mid-aughts, it had become clear that digital work, no matter how easily disseminated, existed within intrinsically fragile infrastructures with potentially short shelf lives. This artwork, ultimately delivered to us on DVDs, certainly fit into that category. My acquisition of the artwork, fortunately, took this into account, thanks to discussions I was able to have with Jeff Martin, a conservator of time-based media who at that time was a fellow at the Hirshhorn, and who has since continued to be an important player in the Smithsonian's approach to preserving new media art. Taking advantage of Jeff's guidance, I adopted new ways of thinking about the acquisition of this artwork, departing from strategies I had used previously. Rather than considering the acquisition of the piece a relatively passive act, simply requiring a standard purchase order in order to remit payment, my approach became one of active interaction with the artist, in which I described our questions and concerns regarding the preservation of the piece. Negotiated terms for its migration to other media in order to ensure ongoing access to it, and conferred with him about those aspects of the work that he considered essential to its future presentation. Among the guarantees the Portrait Gallery made to Salavon was commitment to developing strategies for the long-term preservation of the work. The late-night Triad has since become the first work of fine art to be ingested into the Smithsonian's digital asset management system under the supervision of Alex Cooper of the NPG and Isabel Meyer of the Office of the Chief Information Officer at the Smithsonian. In consulting with Jeff Martin about how to negotiate the acquisition of born digital time-based art with an eye to its long-term preservation, we benefited a great deal from the work of our colleagues at a number of institutions who similarly have been actively concerned with the care of time-based and digital media art. Critical for us were the public resources made available by Matters in Media Art, an outgrowth of the collaborative efforts of SF MoMA, the Tate, and MoMA. Similarly important was the foundational work of the Variable Media Network established by John Ippolito while a curator of media arts at the Guggenheim. Numerous professional networks, particularly that of the Electronic Media Group at the AIC, has provided support for gatherings of professionals focused on the question of the preservation of variable or new media art. The EMG now also publishes an important journal, the Electronic Media Review. Through taking advantage of these resources and models, and I do want to stress that the short list I have provided is by no means exhaustive, the Smithsonian has built its own internal network of specialists, which includes curators, conservators, archivists, registrars, audiovisual specialists, and information technology specialists. Thanks in large part to the dedication of Crystal Sanchez, a new media archivist who works for OCIO and who is a member of the Smithsonian's Time-Based and Digital Media Working Group. The Smithsonian itself is about to release a website, a web resource. I want to note that this builds on the work, important work done by a summer intern last year, Olivia Jean Fagon, who crafted the template or worked with OCIO to develop a template for this. And Crystal has in turn done a great job of engaging input and feedback from the entire working group in developing this. This feature, due to launch shortly, will feature information about specific time-based work and time-based works of art in Smithsonian collections, case studies concerning their care, the results of surveys of roles and practices at the Smithsonian, a survey of its collections, and the results of a broader study concerning the status of and necessary attention to the development of technical standards for the care of time-based and digital media art. This study grows out of a host of interviews conducted with a broad range of experts in the area of time-based media art preservation. Among the questions we hope the study will help to address is the need for preservation standards specific to the care of collections of fine art versus those of archival or other forms of time-based media holdings. Critical for the long-term success of the preservation of time-based media art is the development of protocols within the museum to bring into alignment the priorities of curators, conservators, information specialists, and even museum directors around the installation, acquisition, and care of time-based and digital art. To do this demands making the case for the importance of these efforts by demonstrating their long-term benefits, their deeper philosophical implications, and even their challenges. To this end, it seems imperative to me to take seriously the degree to which the collecting and preservation of time-based media demands a reconsideration of paradigms traditionally associated with the care of artwork, paradigms that were forged in a non-virtual physical universe, necessitating a carefully crafted team-based approach rather than relying on compartmentalized specialization. In this sense, the responsible stewardship of variable media art might arguably be considered a productive force of innovative disruption within the museum. But if destabilizing to some degree, the demands required to stave off the inevitable obsolescence of artworks not properly overseen represents at the same time a regenerative and positive force, presenting new opportunities to rethink what the museum represents in the digital era. In short, digital media, and perhaps time-based digital media in particular, force us to acknowledge the nature of change, rapid change, the forceful nature of which Paik himself observed. In the era of digital curation, something premised upon the active care of digitally based art, the metaphor or the mythic ideal of permanence falls away in favor of a model of flux, a model, as it were, of perpetual evolution. The shift was something that Paik himself foresaw, observing in 1980, and I quote, "The age of information for information's sake is dawning. Communications flow is the new metabolism of Homo sapiens. Constant change in taste and fashion is an organic input-output process, as natural as breathing in our body, waves in the sea, or the waning of the moon." Such flexibility and flow, indeed, leads to the need to re-examine traditional methods for the preservation of collections. Rather than relying upon benign neglect, as noted earlier, one must instead give serious consideration to a model that John Ippolito has described as permanence through change. Thus, in the digital era, museums, recognizing the potential for technical obsolescence, must agree to re-examine management models for the care of time-based art, transforming such care into a proactive system rather than a reflexive activity engaged simply when works are needed for installation. In interrogating our assumptions, first and foremost is to look at the very role of the museum in the digital era. Largely an outgrowth of Western European Enlightenment thinking, the museum has traditionally been conceived as an institution dedicated to the preservation of art from many different eras and points of origin. Such a mission, broadly stated, has also opened the museum as an institution to charges of functioning as a mausoleum by fixing the past in place without regard to pressures of the present. The preservation of time-based art, however, as we have seen today, requires a commitment to its ongoing care and maintenance, thus creating an approach to collections that connects contemporary technology with that of the past, literally refashioning and maintaining historic artworks through innovations of the present. Perhaps even more important, digitally based art need not only exist within the realm of the museum or gallery. Indeed, literalizing André Malraux's notion of a museum without walls, such work can often be as much at home on the internet as in the physical space of the museum. Reimagining the museum requires attention to the potential reconfiguration of professional relationships and workflows, creating new partnerships between departments and potentially even new positions. Indeed, one of the fascinating discoveries of a study conducted by Jeff Martin here at the Smithsonian 2 years ago into the roles and responsibilities of Smithsonian professionals charged with the oversight and care of time-based art is just how few individuals had job titles or corresponding position descriptions that accounted for their work in this realm. This has now begun to change as communication about these responsibilities has expanded. Essential to this has been the broader recognition of the value of a team-based approach to acquisition, installation, and care of time-based art. The MPG, for example, has established DAGGR, the Digital Art Group Roundtable. The team meets regularly to discuss questions related to the documentation, installation, and long-term care of the museum's time-based art and other digital assets. The group includes all of the relevant stakeholders, including curators, registrars, the head of exhibitions, conservators, and members of the MPG's Center for Electronic Research and Outreach Services, in addition to a representative from OCIO, our technology office. Thus, the NPG is engaged in the active development of an internal infrastructure intended to build scales of economy for the development of both expertise and electronic resources to facilitate the long-term care of our time-based collections across the Smithsonian. Even as we benefit from the many achievements this structure has made possible and the new opportunities it is beginning to unlock, I would like to suggest that other synergies and partnerships may be available. Might the active reconceptualization of an interdisciplinary team-based approach to the preservation of time-based media art, for example, also provide new opportunities for its interpretation by scholars using new tools, particularly those interested in the digital humanities? How might museums, particularly those with an expertise in the management of time-based and digital collections, recast themselves not just as centers for collections-based scholarship, but also as institutions capable of supporting new approaches to thinking about history, its interpretation, and its dissemination? To this end, I would also like to speak to the powerful intersection of curator and conservator in the ongoing care and documentation of works of art. Several important case studies have been presented today. What does it mean for curators and conservators to adapt active collaboration as a new model, not just for problem solving, but also for the collection up front of critical information about time-based artworks and the artists who create them, positioning museums as repositories for the archives of the future, which might in turn be actively mined by future publics. Such is already happening now at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, as it assumes responsibility for the care and interpretation of the rich trove of artifacts associated with Paik's archives. What lessons can we draw from the success of these efforts in developing future practices? In an era of new technologies, the care and preservation of time-based art demands both a sensitivity to those elements of an artwork which must be preserved to ensure it remains true to itself, and the flexibility to imagine just how those might be best achieved in a changing technological environment. This suggests we must embrace, to borrow John Hanhart's phrase, permanence and change in our institutions, workflows, and understanding of works of art. And recognizing that the idea implicit in an artwork may be achievable through allowing it to evolve into shifting media, with the authorization of the artist, of course, the preservation of time-based media art may draw on the lessons of conceptually based work of the past century. With his introduction of the ready-made, of which the fountain may be the most famous example, nearly a century ago, and the development in the mid-20th century of his boîte en valise, composed of miniature reproductions of the objects he considered to be among his most important, Duchamp clearly demonstrated that it is the idea behind the work of art that is most critical, even more so than its physical manifestation, an insight that subsequent generations of artists have embraced, even taken for granted. This principle may be key to reconciling ourselves to the need to permit the reproduction and migration of works in order to protect them for future generations. In the mid-1960s, Saul LeWitt famously referred to the idea as the machine that makes the work, and his wall drawings, such as wall drawing number 3, 1969, in the collection of the Hirshhorn, such works are generally the product of the implementation of a set of rules by skilled workers. If we understand the principles behind a work of art, can we then effectively recreate it as an authentic artistic expression of a creator who is no longer present? LeWitt's example would suggest that the answer is yes, if the artist believes so and conforms his or her practice to that principle. To this end, might we be able to productively recontextualize time-based art, particularly that designed for long-term migration, as allographic versus autographic works of art? As the philosopher Nelson Goodman explains, a work is autographic if the most exact duplication of it does not count as genuine. An allographic work, such as a musical score or a poem, has no one acceptable instance, or as Goodman puts it, all correct performances or rendition of the works are equally genuine instances of it. Allographic art we may thereby define as rule-bound. We might also identify it as implicitly interactive, demanding the ongoing engagement of another sensitive and informed partner to offer a personal response, recreating it anew according to agreed-upon principles. And along those lines, I was really quite tickled by John Huffman's story about Paik feeling that he could finally rest in peace, knowing that John had interpreted his work like a Beethoven score. Interactivity, then, requires, in turn, a commitment to collaboration and creativity to represent the artworks in our care most effectively. We must recognize preservation as an inherently democratic activity. And it is here, to my mind, that the greatest excitement, and indeed the most important initiatives in the preservation of time-based art, is to be found. The ongoing commitment to forge new partnerships with artists, colleagues, and audiences in the purpose of a larger end. The innovative preservation of works of art to ensure their ongoing accessibility and meaningfulness to future generations. The quest to take seriously the lessons and promise of Paik and his progeny. Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to invite all our afternoon speakers to our panel on the stage. And we have bottles of water there. And our addition to the panel, as Chris mentioned, is Reinhard Beck. Prior to enrolling in the conservation program for technical cultural objects of the Hochschule für Technik und Wirtschaft at the University of Applied Sciences in Berlin, Reinhard Beck apprenticed as a shipbuilder in Hamburg from 1993 to 1996, as well as interned in the conservation departments of several museums in Germany. He was a fellow at the Swiss Institute of Art Research in Zurich, Switzerland in 2001, and completed his training as an objects conservator in 2002. He holds a graduate degree in the conservation of objects. Reinhard joined the Museum Tinguely in Basel?
Yes.
Thank you, I'm sorry, Switzerland, and was chief conservator from 2002 to 2012. In 2005, he co-organized the symposium Moving Parts on the preservation and documentation of kinetic artworks at the Museum Tinguely. He was a participant of the European Conservation Research Project Inside Installations and Practics 2003 to 2010. In 2009, he was a 12-month conservation research fellow with the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Since 2012, Reinhard is partner of Beck & Frohnert LLC, based in New York City. So, oh good, I see an arm raised already, very good. So again, we have 2 microphones, and we'll take questions, I think, for about 20-25 minutes, so there's time to see the exhibition. Steve?
The question is actually to the conservators on the panel here, which should include pretty much almost everybody. Joanna, I really appreciated the fact that you brought up a nature of time-based media. I think that sometimes gets overlooked because we talk very often about the fluidity and the movement and changeability, especially with Namjoon Paik with his works, but you also have the static nature of the infrastructure that is around, that is in support of it. So I think John was talking about the infrastructure of the casing and the housing. You were talking a little bit about with the acrylic that was used in random access. And I was wondering, how do you deal with a component that is static in that sense that the artist wants to hold on to those materials? It creates the image and the appearance, the aesthetic that he wants, but there is also fluidity to that. You're going to have degrading plastics. You're going to have metal coatings and platings that are going to degrade and that are going to change over time. And I'm wondering how, as conservators, you have been beginning to address some of those issues as they occur.
I think that's the issue in contemporary art conservation in general. That's not a media-specific problem, but a problem of all ephemeral or short-lived materials and systems, basically. I think what conservation has been doing over the last 15 years or so is looking at the artwork and assigning different values to it and identifying the properties that have to be provided in order to show and display the piece with an intact identity, basically. So, and when it comes to unstable media artworks, the main discussion will always be, does it have to be functional in order to be perceived, or might it have accumulated some historic value over time that renders as an object that might develop some independence from that functionality, you know? So you can never really, I can't answer that question just like that, because it's a case-by-case thing, and it's very dependent on the exhibition history of the piece, on the art historical value of the piece, of the reception history of the piece. And in the end, I think we're going to face major compromises. Yeah. Did that answer your question? Maybe.
Just 1 second.
I was really impressed by this Dagger group that you mentioned, Dan. I was just wondering if you can talk about how that came to formation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to acknowledge my colleague Alex Cooper, who pulled it together. But I also have to note that in bringing this group together, the NPG was actually adapting a model at SF MoMA. And indeed, as I was talking with my colleagues earlier today, we were acknowledging that many museums are beginning to turn to that model. MoMA, for example, I'm sure that Guggenheim has something similar. You could probably get a range of input from various museums, LACMA and so forth. But the group has really been extremely successful. It meets, roughly speaking, monthly, and it has been an environment in which we can ask tough questions of one another and try to find mutually agreeable ways to document work. And actually, one of the revelations to me has been the challenge of working in an interdisciplinary way. I think lots of us hold that up as a model and an ideal, and I certainly among them, I think it's incredibly important. But one of the things we've come to realize is that we occasionally have slightly different philosophical paradigms guiding our approach to taking care of things, installing things, things that we think ought to be preserved or not preserved. And occasionally, we use different sorts of language to describe phenomena, or we use terms in slightly different ways. So it's also been sort of revealing in that sense. And I think it really has helped to build an environment in which we're more sensitive to one another's concerns. So it's been very, very productive. Does that help, or was there something else?
Smithsonian seems to be very active and progressive in developing these sort of attention to media arts, and traditionally federal agencies are kind of hard to change and even to like secure the funding.
Well, it's very interesting. I tried to focus on sort of some of the management issues when I gave my remarks, because I do think the management of time-based media and data in general actually is helping to provide new models of getting things done everywhere. And actually, I have to say, I think there are a number of federal agencies that are helping to lead the way in this regard. The Smithsonian was a really terrific place to do this, because there are 19 different institutions under a single umbrella. And the MPG is relatively small. I think the total staff is probably around 50 or so. And it was quite obvious back in 2008, when we were beginning to think seriously about time-based media art acquisition, that we couldn't do it by ourselves. And so fortunately for me, Jeff Martin was very friendly and helpful, and being at the Hirshhorn and being a conservator, it became quite obvious that none of us could do this alone, that we really needed to develop economies of scale. And hence was born this larger collaborative working group that I mentioned. And so Dagger is the NPG subset of that, but designed really to fit into this larger whole. And what what another benefit of that collective organization is that we've been able to get the attention of the Smithsonian administration. Earlier today, Tierna mentioned a number of grants that we've received from the Smithsonian to help support the work that we're doing, surveys, reports. Meetings such as this one are funded in part through that channel. So in fact, I think pulling together has given visibility to the importance of these efforts, and that in turn has helped to attract the type of funding and support that keeps them going.
I think now it's not uncommon for there to be teams like Anne described in museums. And what's been particularly nice here, and especially when we had Anne just across the street, was that the group within the Portrait Gallery, a similar group within American Art, were all coming together under that broader pan-Smithsonian initiative where there was a further exchange of ideas. But we're seeing this as a common model now that's, I think, we're serving most museums very well. John, did you want to
I'm going to add to that. At LACMA, in the last, I guess, 2 years, the museum has decided that there will be a time-based media group, and that includes conservation, registration, AV, IS. I don't even know all the various people who are involved in it. And really the decision came about because in the past, things like the Paik, well, it was maintained by AV for the longest time. As I told you, they weren't around collecting monitors off of lawns and things. But when it really came to its, when it no longer functioned, well, and became up to conservation to try and do something with it. And so conservation and curatorial spent a long time discussing time-based media objects, identifying what the original is, what do we save, what don't we save, what can be thrown out, what must be preserved. And we spent a long, long time in these discussions. Part of the discussion also involved the directors of the time, which were saying we're spending a lot of money acquiring these things, we're going to have to invest a lot of money to preserve them, and what are those investments going to be, including cold storage. So at this particular juncture in LACMA's life, what is important, I think, is that each time something new comes across the threshold, it goes before this group of people, and they can change out, but the basic methodology that is set in place now is to collect the data about every single thing that is considered time-based media, and then it's tracked. Because in the past, a lot of things that would come in by artists such as Bill Viola that would have these enormous stereo stacks of equipment, they would come in and just get a number, and there wasn't any recording of really what all was in that crate. So there's a much greater effort today and a methodology, a consistent methodology that goes into documenting what it is, what we're acquiring, so that we can really figure out over the long haul what will require long-term storage, what will require upgrading, what will require migration in the digital world, who are those facilities that we're going to use, and so on and so forth. So there's a much greater effort because we're really investing in things that become very, very popular with the public or have an accumulation of history in collections across the United States like Paik's work. The museum has decided that we need to be far more methodical about how we're going to handle this particular genre of art.
No, I think the Whitneys had a lot of early problems with that too, where the registrars just didn't know what to do with this stuff. And like Magna TV, for instance, it was only when I went to Germany, I think 3 years ago, that a condition report was finally made up. And these things look like they're just sort of too strange for some registrars to deal with. There's so many different components. You have this picture tube in there, you have this beat up old chassis, and you have this big magnet. And someone's used to handling prints and drawings, it's like really something different.
Way beyond their skill set.
And all the different works, like Dennis Oppenheim, we have these little projectors that takes specimen samples and project it, that are used in chemistry classes, and they would get those down there, and they look very strange. They look like science fiction little things. And
The Whitney Museum in particular is holding a treasure of many, many, many early works from the 60s and the 70s, and this is thanks to John Hanhart, who brought these jewels to the collection. But, well, yeah, we have to understand these works in context, and owning these works is also a responsibility, which is currently reflected at the Whitney Museum of Art, not only focusing at time-based media works in the so-called replication committee. So this is where, on a regular basis, well, challenges in the preservation of contemporary art in general are discussed and represented in a wider forum and in a team. But again, yeah, those works need to be understood in context, and they have a very specific relationship to time, space, and concept, and it's a huge responsibility to own them. This needs to be understood from acquisition on.
And since so many of them exist as parts, that you really need like an installation manual to put it together, because people don't know what this is. They look at just like a bolt or something, not a bolt, but a certain part, and it doesn't make any sense to them why that's around.
The installation component of this, we have a new system, TMS, which is not new to some people, but it's new to us. We're trying to use it to capture all the installation details, because museum people come and go. They go into another museum. But documents need to be created, particularly with these installations, that we install a piece correctly. So there's a lot of effort being put into not only just understanding what the components of something are, but how they assemble and how they look. It's not like a painting that you hang on a wall, or a pot that you put in a pedestal, or a freestanding bronze sculpture. It really is something that has many more components to be grappled with, both on a large scale and even in the minutia of making it work. So there is, I think, an advantage at this point to all of the museums collectively really have sort of wrestled with the animal and say, okay, this is going to stay. We are going to collect more of this. And I think also, as we actively take much greater accounting for the things that are coming across the threshold, I think we've also had to learn that we really need to stay in lockstep with migration activities, because if you don't continue to migrate and keep a handle on these things, there can be too much time has passed, and you haven't converted enough to keep the piece, quote, up to date. I think that's a very important thing, is to be constantly keeping a piece up to date, and that keeps it alive.
And it's interesting that you say that it's here to stay, because I think that was part of the original attitude among some of the normal staff, where it was like, this is just some film video fad. And it's just, pretty soon everybody's going to forget about it, and it's going to sit there in a corner or something. And
it's not.
It's not.
It's not.
And so it's important that we deal with this, which is what we've been trying to do.
Another question?
I'm curious about the curator's perspective of the tensions between the allographic and the autographic, because the museum will assert that it has a unique piece of art, which hopefully will bring people into the doors and it expresses the value in a piece of artwork. Yet at the same time, we've heard many stories, use cases here on sort of reanimating the works of Namjoon Paik, and so that reanimation is part of that allographic story. And John Huffman spoke to sort of getting to the essence of the piece in interpreting Paik's instructions for putting together an installation. So that must be creating some tensions in the curatorial community. Just curious about that.
I'm not sure of any real tensions about that in the curatorial community. I think people, when they come into a contemporary museum, they're not always expecting to see just a normal painting anymore. I think if they see a reproduction of something, that it's more the experience, that the way the work is situated and the way it's placed. Certainly there's no original video projection that's just set. I mean, though people like Bill Viola are very specific about the room and everything else. In terms of an original, it's
Yeah, I might just jump in here for a second, but I'm sure other people here will have a perspective on this, and perhaps other speakers from earlier in the day. I have to acknowledge, I think Pip Lawrenson, who's a very well-known conservator, has also looked at that way of analyzing time-based art or new media electronic art that probably relies on some form of migration long-term for its preservation. I find it extremely exciting because I think it is part of this larger reconfiguration of paradigms within the museum world. And although, Nelson Goodman, it's very interesting, was writing in the 1970s as a philosopher, just as the computer age is really starting to dawn. And interestingly, he actually comes to the conclusion that prints and, I mean, he's thinking about visual art that is still very much analog, and he comes to the conclusion that it will never be the same as a symphony. And I remember rereading that and thinking, wait a minute, actually I don't think he's correct here. This notion of a challenge to originality and all of the sorts of attendant associations with it really goes back to the early part of the 20th century, and Walter Benjamin is probably most famous for mounting this sort of conceptual question about originality in his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And that's a very complex essay, but one of the things he asserts at the outset of it is that reproduction moves us away from traditional notions of genius that may be associated with the unique original. Certainly, I think there will always be a lot to be taken away from a sort of quote-unquote original work that was designed to be unique, a painting, a sculpture. I don't mean to discount that. But I do think new media works challenge that notion of originality, and they suggest in their very nature that there may be a collaborative dimension, and the idea that an artwork should be a partnership with the future, I think, is a new way of thinking about how creativity can be manifested. I wanted to attach it to a longer history of conceptual art by recalling people like Duchamp and Saul LeWitt to make, and this is sort of a curatorial insight, that this is, in some sense, is not really a new concept, that the idea can be left intact but manifested in different media, because I think it helps provide some intellectual scaffolding that enables us to acknowledge that if that is consistent with the artist's conceptual understanding of the work, there's no problem in terms of what we are doing as professionals. I think we're still respecting what that artist wanted of us as stewards of the work.
I think I might want to add a little bit to that as well. As a conservator, I feel that allographic works really challenge the institution because they require not only our department, but every other involved department as well, to very actively manage the change, to control that the different instances of it or the different iterations of the work are actually successful and represent the work properly, which puts an incredible emphasis on documentation. And I could spend my entire work time just documenting, preparing, setting up, and documenting all the iterations of our allographic works or those works that have allographic aspects to them. And I am spending a lot of my time doing that, but it's still not enough. And I think institutions generally underestimate that a lot in acquiring media and performance art or performative artworks into the collection and not dedicating enough staff time to their constant management and maintenance. It's a real problem, and there's a big discrepancy between what needs to be done and what can be done with current institutional structures.
If I may add something to that, I totally agree with you, Joanna, and I was thinking in the past, when I was working in a museum, Tingley in Basel, I was thinking about all the different types of documentation we can do, like writing and drawing and photographing and filming and computer 3D modeling and all that. And I was probably in the very end thrown back to the spoken word and the writing, and I'm coming back to this morning to interviews from people, from witnesses of the time, from the artists, from assistants, as one of the most important sources for documentation. I always come back to that. Additionally to what we do more technically, drawing, we draw, we do our specifications, we write what the color of the wall might be, but I always come back to that. And additionally to that, I think that we have to, you spoke about the essence of the work, and this is what I always try to come up with in cooperation with the curator, to try to define the essence of the work. And this is very hard, but it can be done outspoken or written or something, but that's the only way to come up with that in words. So I find that very important in cooperation with the curator.
Yeah, and you have to make the case institutionally that 30 media artworks might generate more work than 300 or 3,000 paintings. And that's a very hard case to make. Is it really justified to dedicate a conservator's work time on the media artworks when we only own 200 of them? We only have 3 paintings conservators for 2,000 paintings, you know? So that's a statistic that we use to shape our arguments, and we really have to start to understand how much more work is needed to maintain and to preserve time-based media.
I totally agree, and I always like to use this metaphor that once you receive a loan request and you walk into your storage area to look at a painting or a sculpture, you can, by visual examination, you can pretty much tell whether or not it's in a stable or not so stable condition, or if it's acceptable to agree to this loan request. And this is completely different with media-based art, because when you walk into your storage area, you look at the tape, you look at the cables, you look at equipment. If you don't put it together, you know nothing about your works. This condition is entirely hidden. And this alone adds so much more workload and adds so much more understanding about the concept of the work, that our visual examination is really limited to a very, very small degree to understand the work and concept.
Those are excellent points. I'm watching the clock. Oh, let's have one more question. Oh, definitely. No, let's do one more.
I'm just over here, like, vigorously nodding my head to all this documentation. Like, that's all I think I ever do. And it's really, I mean, time-based media is obviously a huge part of that. And I'm more familiar with what is going on in institutions and how various institutions are dealing with their documentation and their time-based media groups. And I'm just interested to hear from Christina and Reinhard, and working sort of independent company as conservators and dealing with private collectors. And if you could speak a little bit about the process of, we have file systems and ways of organizing our documentation and knowing that it's going to go along with that object through the life of the object in that institution. And we're working with our colleagues in the media team, but I'm assuming you have a media team, but it's just different, working with different independent contractors and working with the collector and so forth. How do you try to ensure that that documentation is going to go with the object through its life?
I start, you
Okay.
take over. I have a very funny example of that. I once, 2 years ago, I worked on a little sculpture, tiny little thing by John Tingley for a Swedish collector, and it was an electronic part, and it was broken originally. So it looked like a face, and the eye was broken. It was hanging a little bit off on wires, the whole eye, and it looked weird, but it was supposed to look like that originally. I had original photographies from the 1960s, and sometime between 1960 and 2000, I have to add, I did it already a second time now. So sometimes in between 1960 and 2000 and probably 8, somebody glued that eye back in place and altered this original work of art. So what I had to do, I tried successfully, quite successfully, to remove the glue again and move the eye back out of place. So it looked, it was more complicated, but that was the whole thing. And I made a very nice documentation. I produced a very nice documentation, including a movie and everything, and provided it to the owner, who was a gallerist. And last year, the same piece came back to me, the eye back in place. No, it came through me. It came to me through Sotheby's, and no documentation, nothing came with it. So there's just no. I mean, we as a company now we keep our records, but what else?
Others don't.
Foundation. I mean, is it something where you contact the foundation, the estate, and try and hand that off for their archives as well, so that it's in several locations, or?
Well, if I may add, so since we both have very, very strong museums backgrounds, we know and understand how museums works and how they archive their documents and how we should provide our documentation to make it fit into their systems and their databases. And so far, we basically work with museums and some artist estates. So we look at the way they document and adapt our system a little bit to make it fit with their needs, but of course we first look if all the basic documentation is available, if the installation manuals are in place, if the basic information on the media is provided, and if certain components, important components are missing, we provide that.
But once the work is back on the art market,
out of our hands.
It's out of our hands, right. And it's hard. I mean, I can add also, it's very hard to suggest to private collectors to the whole documentation thing. This is very costly, it's very time intensive, and to convince them to pay for that and that pays off in the very end is time intensive. And
also we often see works later in their life when they have been owned by private owners for a couple of years, and then they were given to institutions. So they are acquisitions when you are in the position to gather much information at the point of acquisition, but they're also gifts. And you don't have as much of a powerful position at a later point in time to add all and ask for all the information that is so important for the preservation of those works. So we see this a lot.
Right now we are in process we do actually, we are commissioned to carry out a documentation on an important work by Bob Whitman, and for this, it looks right now, it's a very difficult process because the client really doesn't understand how time intensive and costly that is. And we are negotiating right now because there are some fabrication costs, refabrication costs involved, and I think we will face that in future very often with private clients, that it's just a very costly long-term process, yeah.
Any final comments from the panel before we wrap up? That was, I think, a very good session. I know it's probably coffee time for most of us. Before we leave this stage, I'd like to ask Chris Wayner to close our program.
Well, mainly I'd just like to thank all of our afternoon and our morning speakers for spending the time, and for many of you traveling the miles to be here with us today. You're all so busy and you put off deadlines in order to make a new one for us, and it was such a rewarding and fulfilling symposium for all involved. Thank you to the Lunder staff and interns who spent so much time running around in registration and everything else that you did. To Tierna for really conceiving of the program and for driving it for months now, and to Allie Jessing as well for supporting it along the way in so many ways. I've learned a great deal myself here today, including the ins and outs of running movies on Macs and embedding them into PowerPoints, which is valuable in my line of work. But moreover, a lot more distinct in terms of the conservation and the exhibition of Namjoon Paik, and how those concerns tie into the greater overture of the preservation of time-based media art. The exhibition is upstairs on the 3rd floor. I hope you can take some time to go up and walk through it. You've heard so much about it throughout the course of the day, and it would be a pity not to go and experience it while it's so near. And with that, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you all very much again.